Alright, guys, I want to just do a brief overview of how climate cycles uh, affect geopolitical events and movements. So you can kind of see the world through the eyes of empires and understanding how to adapt in that situation. So basically, the vast majority, over 90% of the Earth's history has been in an ice age, and you can see that they align with solar cycles. So if you're looking for search words, I'm not going to get into the science of this because there is a lot of scientists that are actually not even associated with the fossil fuel industry or anything like that that support this hypothesis. But there's a lot of good alignment, and when you look at align the collapse of empires and times of political turmoil, they seem to align with the sun cycles and the temperature cycles. And this makes sense, when the sun goes into one of its cooling phases, which again, majority of Earth's history it's been in, there's less food and political turmoil precedes it. So that's just the basic overview. The things you're going to look for are solar minimums, grand solar minimums, sun cycles, the Maunder minimum, those kind of things, and ice ages. So those are some search terms you can do your own research on. You're going to find some conflicting data or conflicting opinions and a lot of arguments from authority on the global warming kind of bandwagon. But when you look up sun cycles, it is the most accurate climate prediction model that I've came across. So luckily we're in the Arizona area, breaking down the map. So these are the kind of habitable zones where you can see the you can grow plants and live in these areas. And just breaking down the map, I mean, when you look at the hotspots, they align up with where the political hotspots align. So it's really fascinating to kind of see this breakdown, because I think that the empires are fighting for position of these habitable zones. So all kinds of conflict in Africa. It usually doesn't make the news, but you have China buying up large portions, investing in here. You have the U.S. military and the U.S. investments in here for a long time. So empires are all jockeying over Africa, and they say that humanity arose from Africa because it can trace lots of roots back here. But when you can see that it's the powerhouse, it's in the most habitable zone in an ice age, so you can see why there's such tension here. So going up, what else do you have? You have China building up areas in the South China Sea, so they're building up military installations here, probably because they knew that in the last solar minimum that wiped out the Vikings, that the Eskimos were able to survive 80% off sea life. So sea life is still going to be around, and you can use that for energy resources in the South China Sea. They want it for fishing, and so they're looking to protect that area. You have China also having a bunch of ghost cities. Most of these cities are located within the 45th parallel here. And why, I don't think that, I think there is a plan to a lot of the things that the Chinese do. I think they're an old empire. I think they're a deep thinking empire, so they're very, very strategic. And I think they built up those large empty cities for a reason, because they're going to have a lot of migrants coming from the colder inhabitable area. They want centralized populations so they can either control them and or support them, because concentrated populations are easier to control and support. You also have China buying up large portions of Australian land. So they're heavily invested in Australian farmland. I think they're looking to be able to feed their people, and that's my operating theory. Obviously, I mean, they're feeding them now, but they're positioning themselves to be able to capitalize on that. So that's kind of what we're looking at. We have the hyperinflation going on in the Venezuela area as well, and so that could be turmoil. That could be the classic tactic is to drive a country into debt and then buy up all its natural assets, natural resources. That could be what's playing on there. Obviously, that's just speculation about the true intentions of that. But you see a lot of the conflict. Oh, another interesting thing here. You can see how pressured Russia is going to be in an ice age. So they have all this land, and most of it is not going to be usable. And so you have Russia pushing into Ukraine. And I heard one commentator from the Adapt 2030 channel, a great source of information on this change, which looks to be around, accelerating. These are longer term cycles, but between 2020 and 2030, you're going to start seeing this slow creep of what's capable as far as what's useful for energy and what's edible. So you have Russia pushing into Ukraine. There's a lot of arable land there. I mean, that's still in the green-yellow zone. So potentially you could be using that as a food source. And of course you have the Syrian conflict, still also in the orange zone, but it's an oil pipeline. So you're going to see lots of drive and desire for energy in such a period. And control over the energy in such in a stressed world, in a pressured world, is going to be important. So that's some interesting breakdowns in the geopolitics. Let's go through some of the historical facts of this. So this is a juxtaposition, again, from the Adapt 2030 channel of collapsing Chinese empires, which they have a tremendous written history going back thousands of years, and when there were other previous solar minimums. So you can see that when people got hungry, this is the pattern, but people overthrow their governments. And in such a scenario, absolutely, you can see that happening. And so with all these little historical turmoils, you can see them prepping for the next solar cycle, which appears to be at our doorstep. When you look at the pole shift, when you look at extended winters, when you look at beached events and bird confusion and those kind of things, they all use the Earth's pole to navigate. And if it's moving around, they're going to beach themselves. So, there's a lot of news headlines that say, oh, we don't know why. They know why. I mean, there's millions of dollars invested in that kind of research. So, very interesting alignment in societal breakdowns and solar cycles, which affect food production mainly. And it also brings an onset of disease, but between that and food, that kind of pressure, the governing bodies tend to break down. So you see a rough concentration of the Chinese ghost cities. You see them southern part of China and the middle part of China, but all part of population control in the kind of transition and ready to provide housing to migrants that may not be in habitable zones. Again, all of Africa is basically up for grabs as far as being habitable, being arable, and grabbing resources from them. So you see all the Chinese investments here. You see this is Australia, all the Chinese investments there. And just to throw in the mix, you have the U.S. military installments. You can see the highest concentration within all the habitable zones in such a transition. So that's kind of what I'm seeing, and this has been the kind of unifying factor of all kinds of turmoil that I'm seeing. It seems to be the thread that's pulling it all together for me, especially when you look at the alignment being that the next, what's called a mini ice age, you already see a 30% cut in production in the crops this year, the wheat crops. So you see pressure on wheat crops and yield crops this year. You'll see an acceleration of it next year. So that's already been projected out by the financial world to anticipate that in the futures market. So, the money, when money's involved and big money's at stake, it kind of strips the politics out of it. And if that's your leading indicator, this is one of those times that they're probably aware of. I mean, this is pretty predictable when you can measure things going back this long. You can predict the next sun cycle. So, which brings me to things like Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. When I look at those dates and align them with the next dip in the sun cycle, they line up perfectly. So my thinking is that they plan to use, you see a big run up in the U.S. debt, and that's every central bank around the world is running huge debts, huge deficits, and their balance sheets are all growing at the moment. And my thinking is they just plan to run that system to exhaustion, so they're going to get as much benefit out of that debt system as possible before it's no longer sustainable when you have the pinprick from the food production dropping, and at that point you'll have to transition to a sound money economy, gold or crypto economy. And with that date runs around 2030 at the height, in 2020 at the onset, or at the noticeable onset. So you'll see more and more noticeable things coming up next year, and at 2020 it'll be roughly obvious when people start to people will be in denial about global warming until 2020 is my projection about how society is going to evolve. I'm talking about the majority of society. So it's just something to be aware of. It definitely made me focus on food more and place. Of course, we're lucky to be in Arizona. That's a pretty habitable area. But yeah, that's just something to be aware of as far as why everything seems to be focused on this 2021 through 2030 as far as the powers that be go. So, all right, thanks for listening. Bye-bye.